You know, every night there's this number that just sits quietly in the back of many of our minds. It's a number we rarely actually say out loud, at least not in this specific context. Consider the number 40. Now, I'm not talking about a 40-hour work week, though trust me, that is a massive topic we are absolutely going to unpack today. I want you to think about 40 years. 40 years of your life traded away primarily just to earn money. And what's the grand prize you get in return for giving up the literal prime of your life? Weekends. 2 days of freedom for every 5 days of labor. When you really step back and look at it, it begs a rather uncomfortable question. Do you currently need permission just to be human? Like seriously, think about your daily routine right now. Does eating your lunch, resting your eyes, or even using the restroom require institutional permission or a scheduled break in your day? You know, kids are taught from kindergarten to raise their hands and ask for a permission slip just to use the bathroom. But when we graduate into adulthood, well, that bell schedule and those permission slips don't actually disappear. They just get rebranded as corporate policy. So today, we're diving into this fascinating explainer based on the deeply analytical views of YouTuber Tom Scrylius and some related source materials. We're going to discuss the world directly from his perspective, specifically zooming in on the anatomy of modern wage slavery. We'll be pulling back the curtain on how our modern labor system wasn't just some natural evolution of human progress, but rather something that was historically and deliberately engineered. We're looking closely at the invisible chains forged in the years 1773 and 1926, and how they quite literally rewrote your life. Okay, here's our roadmap for today. We're going to cover the wage slavery illusion, the events of 1773 and 1926, the totalitarian workplace, and finally, the psychological toll. Let's get right into it. Section 1, the wage slavery illusion. Now, to properly frame Scrylius's perspective here, we first need to define the terminology used in the sources. According to this analysis, wage slavery is defined as a totalitarian system. It's a structure where individuals completely surrender control over their own time, their identity, and even their physical movement, simply in exchange for basic survival. So it's not about literal physical chains, right? It's about a system where a lack of compliance results in an inability to afford food or shelter. And this system radically shifted how we view time. Before the Industrial Revolution, work was task-oriented. You farmed your land, you built a house, maybe you fixed a tool. When the task was done, your time was your own. It was perfectly aligned with the natural rhythms of the seasons. But post-industrial labor, that became time-oriented. The factory bell completely replaced natural rhythms. You suddenly worked because the clock said it was time to work, turning human hours into a commodity owned by an employer. Get this. We are constantly told that modern technology and corporate efficiency have given us the best quality of life in human history. Yet, historical estimates reveal that a 15th century medieval peasant actually enjoyed anywhere from 80 to 150 days off per year, mostly thanks to seasonal downtime and religious festivals. Today, a modern corporate employee is incredibly lucky to get 10 to 14 days of paid vacation. I mean, despite all our advanced technology, we are working significantly more days per year than peasants did in the Middle Ages. Wild, right? Moving on to Section 2, 1773, and engineering a workforce. This systemic shift didn't just happen by accident. It builds across a timeline of invisible chains. It starts with a theft of common land in the 18th century, moves straight into the criminalization of poverty in the 19th century, and culminates in the commodification of our daily time in the 20th century. So it all kicks off with the Enclosure Acts in England. Prior to 1773, communities shared vast amounts of common land. You could forage, graze animals, and grow food to survive independently. But then, the government passed laws that essentially privatized 7 million acres of this public land. Suddenly, it was fenced off. The public was entirely stripped of their ability to be self-sufficient. And, Scrylius points out, this was a deliberate state and corporate strategy to force a mass migration into factory towns, effectively engineering a desperate labor class that was completely dependent on wages. And early capitalists actually feared people returning to the land. I mean, if you could survive on your own, you would never accept brutal 16-hour factory shifts. So the state stepped in again. The 1834 Poor Law Amendment Act essentially made survival outside of the factory system a literal crime. If you were poor and unemployed, you were sent to a workhouse. The choice was engineered to be absolute: work in the system or starve in a prison. Which brings us to Section 3, 1926, and the productivity hack. We absolutely have to look at the man who standardized modern work, Henry Ford. Listen to this ominous quote from him.
He famously noted, "It is well that the people of the nation do not understand our banking and monetary system, for if they did, I believe there would be a revolution before tomorrow morning." This really illustrates that Ford's motives were deeply rooted in systemic control and a keen understanding of economic leverage, not necessarily worker benevolence.
In 1926, Henry Ford implemented the 8-hour shift and the 40-hour workweek. Now, history loves to celebrate this as a massive, generous victory for labor rights. But the source analysis deconstructs this myth completely. Ford reduced hours from 16 to 8 because his own internal data showed that a human being's physical efficiency plummeted after exactly 8 hours. It wasn't a gift for work-life balance. It was a carefully calculated biological and psychological hack designed to squeeze the absolute maximum output from human bodies before they broke down on the assembly line. Section 4. The Totalitarian Workplace. Skrylus breaks down what he calls the lies of the labor system, contrasting comforting cultural myths with some pretty harsh realities. We're told corporations care about us, right? But wellness initiatives are ultimately just tools to boost productivity. We're told our salaries are fair, but they are fixed contracts where the company captures every single drop of excess value you generate. And the biggest myth of all, the illusion of freedom. The reality is that modern debt and complete reliance on continuous employment make true independent freedom nearly impossible for the average worker. To maintain this level of obedience, the system relies on strict institutional control mechanisms. It starts early with the educational filter, schooling designed to train kids to follow bells and suppress natural curiosity in favor of compliance. Then comes the debt leash, student loans and mortgages that tie your basic survival directly to a corporate paycheck. And today, it all culminates in algorithmic governance. We literally have warehouse and office workers whose bathroom breaks are timed and penalized by software code, dictating their every physical movement. Finally, Section 5, the psychological toll. Oh man, I bet you felt this one. The sources define a phenomenon called the Sunday funeral. It's that highly relatable, pervasive sense of anxiety and dread that slowly creeps in, usually peaking right around 3 p.m. on a Sunday afternoon. The analysis frames this not just as a bad mood, but as a literal physiological rejection by your body against having to re-enter an unnatural labor cycle the very next morning. And when Monday does arrive, workers are forced to put on what is called the professional avatar. To survive in quiet, heavily monitored offices, employees must emotionally dissociate. They have to suppress their true personalities to wear this polite corporate mask, forcing themselves to feign deep interest in administrative tasks that offer absolutely no real meaning to their lives. The emotional suppression required to do this is just exhausting. And actually, that exhaustion is the key. The analysis points out that burnout is not a flaw in the system, it's a deliberate feature. When you're tired, you don't plan long-term, you don't research alternatives or build an exit strategy. The system is perfectly calibrated to leave you with just enough energy to rest, recover, and show up again the next morning. And this applies everywhere, by the way. High-income corporate professionals are burning out in their polished offices just as hard as minimum-wage service workers. To really summarize this perspective, we look to a profound thought from philosopher Noam Chomsky. He noted that early industrial workers saw themselves as not very different from slaves, except for one grim detail. They had the technical freedom to starve if they chose not to work. It highlights the absolute core argument of wage slavery here, the idea that choice is merely an illusion when the alternative is ruin. We'll leave you with this final thought to linger on. Based on the historical engineering we've mapped out today, from the land enclosures of 1773 all the way to the productivity hacks of 1926, you really have to ask yourself, is your 40-hour workweek truly a natural law of human existence, or is it a carefully crafted, invisible chain that you've been trained to wear? Think about it. Thank you for joining us for this explainer, and we'll see you next time.
Usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there's this expectation of absolute precision.
Right, yeah, it's binary.
Exactly. It's
Yeah.
like engineering. You break your arm, you go to the hospital, and the x-ray shows that jagged white line, and the doctor just points at the screen and says, well, there it is. That's the problem.
Right, it's clean. You have a pathogen, you get an antibiotic, you have a fracture, you get a cast. I mean, the causality is entirely visible.
Broken or not broken. We like things to be visible, to
Yeah.
be, easily categorized and treated. But imagine walking into a doctor's office and listing off a very, very different set of symptoms.
Okay.
You sit down and you say you have like this chronic exhaustion that sleep just doesn't fix. You have a literal pit of dread in your stomach every Sunday afternoon. You have elevated blood pressure, maybe random muscle spasms in your neck, and a profound sense of dissociation for about 8 hours a day.
Which sounds awful.
Right. And the doctor just looks at you, puts down the chart, and says, well, there's no disease here. You're just employed.
Yeah. It is, it's the ultimate diagnostic blind spot, really.
It is.
Because we are treating the biological symptoms of a system that we've been conditioned to accept as entirely normal. I mean, we're looking at a physiological reality that society has completely normalized as just, the baseline cost of being an adult.
Which is exactly what YouTuber and author Tom Scrilius argues in his structural breakdown of modern employment.
Right.
We are going to unpack his very provocative worldview today. Now, to be clear to you listening, we are just exploring his thesis here, not necessarily endorsing it, but he presents this really fascinating historical and structural critique of what he calls modern wage slavery.
Yeah, that's a loaded term.
It is extremely loaded.
Yeah.
But we are going to look at that term not as some, dramatic hyperbole or internet exaggeration, but as a deeply engineered system of control. We're looking specifically at how the years 1773 and 1926 fundamentally rewrote the human experience.
Exactly, and how the 40-hour work week is not some natural evolution of human progress, but a carefully constructed cage.
All right.
And we really need to examine the mechanics of that cage. Because the argument here is that this structure dictates bodily autonomy, it controls your time, and it operates with a surprisingly totalitarian undertone.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because when you throw around a word like totalitarian in relation to like a standard office job or a warehouse gig, that immediately gets my guard up.
Sure, of course it does.
I mean, we typically associate that word with
Yeah.
dictatorships, right? Secret police, people disappearing in the night. It feels pretty extreme to apply it to an HR department.
It does sound extreme at first, but Skrailis argues that modern employment mimics a totalitarian regime in ways we don't even process anymore, just because we are so steeped in it.
How so?
Well, under this system, your most basic human functions like when to eat, when to sleep, when to move your body, and even, honestly, when to use the restroom, suddenly they require institutional permission.
Which, when you say it out loud like that, is kind of crazy.
It is. Think about the mechanics of how we're taught to view this arrangement from a very young age. We are conditioned to view work as a fair, balanced trade.
Right. Time for money.
Exactly. You give up a certain amount of your time, and in exchange, you get money. A simple, voluntary transaction. But the critique is that it's actually a massive surrender of bodily and psychological autonomy.
Because you're giving up more than just the hours.
So much more. The modern worker isn't just selling their labor or their physical output. They are selling their identity. I mean, you have to perform enthusiasm.
Oh, the performance. Yeah.
You have to actively suppress your natural animal instincts to rest when you're tired or, to move when you're restless. You have to mask your true personality to survive the corporate ecosystem.
Which is exhausting.
It's an immense amount of emotional labor that is completely absent from the job description. But it is undeniably the most expensive thing you provide to your employer.
There's a very specific, almost absurd anecdote Tom shares in his sources that perfectly illustrates this performance aspect.
Oh, the consulting one.
Yeah, the consulting gig. So he talks about a time he was working as a corporate consultant. And he got really, really efficient at his job. He analyzed the bottlenecks, automated certain processes, streamlined his workflow, and eventually he figured out how to finish a full day's work, like 8 hours of expected contracted output in just 3 hours.
Wow.
Yeah, he was producing the exact same value for the company, just much faster.
And fundamental market logic would dictate that efficiency should be rewarded, right?
You would think.
I mean, if you deliver the product in half the time, you should gain the surplus of that time.
Right. So he goes to his manager with this entirely logical proposition. He asks, on days when my work is completely finished and verified, can I just leave early?
And let me guess.
The answer was a flat no.
Of course.
Not because the work wasn't good, not because there was more work to be done, but because the system wasn't actually buying his output. It was buying his physical presence.
He was buying his time.
Exactly. It was buying his time. So he ends up having to stretch 3 hours of actual valuable work into 8 hours of presence. He describes this incredibly surreal reality of standing in an empty office hallway, looking out a window, and pretending to be on a phone call with a non-existent person just to look busy in case a manager walked by.
It's the performance of labor prioritized over the production of value.
It's sadness.
And that performance is absolutely mandatory. If we connect this to the underlying architecture of the system, it reveals that the institution doesn't actually care about efficiency if that efficiency results in fewer working hours for the employee.
Wait, really? Why wouldn't they care about efficiency?
Because if your survival wasn't chained to a constant, mandatory 40-hour presence, the entire control structure would unravel. I mean, people with free time are unpredictable. People with free time start asking questions.
No, I see.
And while standing in a hallway pretending to be on a phone call is a somewhat comical white-collar absurdity, the technological evolution of the same control mechanism is genuinely chilling.
Yeah, you were talking about the algorithmic governance.
Yes.
The shift from a human manager telling you to look busy to a machine mathematically tracking your biological needs.
Exactly. Take the reality of modern supply chain and warehouse workers. There is a documented reality of warehouse workers being flagged and written up by automated systems, not human managers, but proprietary algorithms.
Just code.
Just code. There was a specific case where a system detected that a worker's bathroom breaks were 11% longer than the facility average over a 2-week period.
11%? That's what, like an extra minute or two?
Literally seconds to minutes. And he received a coded, automated warning for underperforming.
Oh my God.
There was no human context considered. No one asked if he was feeling unwell. No biological empathy whatsoever. Just raw data, a mathematical threshold, and a warning that his livelihood was in jeopardy.
And what did he do?
Well, his response wasn't to quit and protest. His response was to start suppressing his bodily needs. He started holding it.
Which is terrifying. I mean, that is genuinely dystopian.
Yeah.
But I have to push back here because this is where the terminology really matters.
Go for it.
Calling a strict algorithm or a demanding manager totalitarian or wage slavery, it still feels rhetorically inflated. Because ultimately, you sign a contract.
You do?
No one puts a gun to your head and forces you into that specific warehouse. You can quit. It's a voluntary exchange in a free market, unlike an actual totalitarian state where you literally have no choice and cannot leave the borders.
That's a fair distinction.
It feels a bit more like renting an apartment with a landlord who has really strict, overbearing rules. You might hate the rules, but you aren't living in a prison cell. You can always move. Right?
That is the standard defense of the system, absolutely. And it's a completely logical way to frame it if we accept the current economic baseline as a given.
Okay.
But we have to examine the illusion of that choice. The philosopher and linguist Noam Chomsky actually addressed this exact dynamic.
What did he say?
He argued that wage slaves are only different from actual slaves in that they have the freedom to starve.
Wow, the freedom to starve. But wait, starvation was a threat in nature too.
Right.
If a prehistoric hunter-gatherer didn't hunt or, a medieval peasant didn't farm, they starved. Nature is oppressive in that way.
Yeah.
So how is modern capitalism uniquely totalitarian compared to just the natural human condition of needing to acquire food?
What's fascinating here is that is the crucial distinction. Natural scarcity is not the same as engineered scarcity.
Explain that.
In nature, if you don't hunt or gather, you starve, yes. But the woods are open to you, the river is open to you, you have direct access to the means of your own survival.
Right, you can just go out and try to get food.
Exactly. What Chomsky and Scrylius are pointing out is that in our modern system, that direct access has been severed. Your survival is entirely conditional on your obedience to a third party.
The employer.
Yes. You can choose which corporation to submit to, absolutely. You can change your landlord in your apartment analogy. But you cannot choose to exist outside the system of wage labor without facing absolute destitution, criminalization, loss of healthcare, and loss of shelter.
You can't just opt out.
You can't. When the gap between your paycheck and total physical crisis is a matter of weeks, the choice to work isn't really a choice at all. It is coercion dressed up as a legal contract.
So it's an artificial choke point.
Exactly. You are paying a toll just to exist on the earth.
Man. Okay, so if this system is so unnatural, so restrictive, and so contrary to basic human autonomy, how did humanity ever agree to it?
Well, we didn't.
Because we didn't just wake up one Tuesday and collectively decide to hand over our bodily autonomy to algorithms and corporate managers, right? There had to be a transition.
There was, and it was brutal. To understand how we got here, we have to look back at history. We have to identify the precise historical moment when the alternative to wage labor, that direct access to nature we just talked about, was illegally and systematically erased.
Which takes us to the year 1773 and the era of the Enclosure Acts in England.
Yes.
This is where the historical engineering of the labor class really transitions from an organic social structure to a highly engineered system.
It's a massive shift.
Between the years 1604 and 1914, the British Parliament passed over 5,000 individual laws that essentially privatized roughly 7 million acres of common land.
This is perhaps one of the most consequential yet, consistently under-discussed shifts in human history.
Why under-discussed?
Because it's often painted as agricultural improvement rather than mass displacement.
Mm-hmm.
But we're talking about the profound, forceful transition from a land-based economy to a labor-based economy.
Okay, let's break that down. What did the land-based economy look like?
Well, it's vital to understand what the commons actually were. Before these acts, peasants and villagers could survive relatively independently. They weren't wealthy, life was undeniably hard, and disease was rampant, of course, but they had established generational common rights.
What does that mean in practice?
It means they could forage in the forests for firewood and food. They could grow crops on small, shared plots of land. They could graze their sheep or cattle on open pastures.
So they didn't need a boss.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They had a baseline of self-sufficiency that did not require a monetary wage.
And then the fences went up?
Literally and metaphorically. The aristocratic class and early agrarian capitalists used parliamentary law to draw lines around this shared earth.
They just took it.
By fencing off this land and handing it over to private ownership, the state effectively criminalized survival outside of the capitalist framework. You couldn't just go live off the land anymore.
Because it wasn't yours.
Right. Doing what your ancestors had done for centuries suddenly became trespassing, vagrancy, or theft.
So it's basically like playing a massive game of Monopoly, but halfway through the game, one player manages to buy the board itself. And they tell the other players, hey, you're still completely free to roll the dice. You can go wherever you want on the board. But every single square suddenly has a toll. You aren't playing to win anymore, or even to build anything. You are just frantically rolling the dice every turn just to avoid going to jail.
That analogy perfectly captures the mechanical shift. Because the system didn't just take the land, it built a punitive apparatus for anyone who failed to pay the toll.
Right.
Take the 1834 Poor Law Amendment Act.
Oh, this is dark.
It really is. If you were displaced from the land by the Enclosure Acts and you failed to find wage work in the new industrial centers, the state didn't just leave you alone to figure it out. You were sent to a workhouse.
And these workhouses were explicitly designed to be terrifying.
They were intentionally engineered to be harsh, degrading, and punitive environments. Families were separated upon entry. Husbands, wives, children, all split up.
Just for being poor.
Just for being displaced. The labor was mindless and physically destructive, like unpicking old ropes or crushing bones for fertilizer.
Crushing bones. That's incredibly bleak.
It is. And the food was borderline starvation rations. The explicit legislative goal of the workhouse was to ensure that literally any factory job, no matter how dangerous, poorly paid, or degrading, looked better by comparison.
It was a manufactured rock bottom.
Yeah.
You create a floor so horrific that people will gratefully accept exploitation just to stay 1 inch above it.
Exactly.
The economist Michael Perelman, who is cited in this framework, talks about this extensively in his work on the invention of capitalism. He asserts that early capitalists didn't just stumble into a willing workforce.
No, they didn't.
They genuinely feared people returning to the land. I mean, if a family could feed themselves with a small garden and a shared pasture, why on earth would they ever agree to walk into a dark, dangerous, coal-fired factory and work for 14 hours a day?
They wouldn't. They absolutely wouldn't. The industrial system needed a desperate labor pool. It could not function on voluntary, leisurely participation.
It requires desperation.
Yes. The factories of the Industrial Revolution required a mass population that had absolutely no alternative but to sell their time and their bodies just to survive.
And it's wild because history books so often reframe this era. Like, we're taught in school that the Industrial Revolution was an era of pure progress, a natural, glorious evolution of human innovation and technology pulling humanity out of the mud.
Right, the march of progress.
But the critique here is that it was engineered displacement. It was the deliberate, legal dismantling of human self-sufficiency to feed a new economic engine.
And you might think, well, that was the 1700s and 1800s. It was a brutal transition, but we've moved past that. We have labor rights now.
You're not at workhouses anymore.
Right. But the argument extrapolates this forward to today, suggesting that the underlying mechanism never actually went away. We see modern versions of the Enclosure Acts baked right into our local laws right now, designed to ensure we remain dependent on a wage.
Like what? What's a modern Enclosure Act?
Well, the mechanisms are just more bureaucratic now. Look at local zoning codes and municipal laws that serve the exact same function, criminalizing self-sufficiency.
Oh, like off-grid living.
Exactly. There are documented cases of people in places like Oregon or Colorado facing severe fines or even jail time for collecting rainwater on their own property because the state claims ownership of the watershed.
That's insane. Rainwater.
Rainwater. And there are zoning codes in states like Florida that make it explicitly illegal to grow vegetables in your own front yard. You are legally required to maintain a purely aesthetic grass lawn.
Right, or laws against living in a tiny home or an RV on land you own because the dwelling doesn't meet a minimum square footage requirement designed for tax purposes.
Exactly. In most municipalities, you cannot fish in a local lake without a license, you cannot sleep outside without being cited for loitering, and you cannot light a fire.
The alternative to the system has basically been legally regulated out of existence. Every natural avenue for survival has a paywall.
A paywall, that's a great way to put it.
It ensures that you cannot simply opt out. You have to buy your food, you have to buy your water, you have to pay property taxes, even if you own your home outright. Which means you absolutely have to have a continuous influx of monetary wages.
Yeah.
You are structurally forced to be dependent.
You are. So the Enclosure Acts force humanity off the land, remove their independence, and push them into the factories.
Right.
We get the brutal reality of the early Industrial Revolution, people working 16 hours a day, 6 days a week, children in coal mines, total physical devastation.
It was a nightmare.
But then, history tells us, a savior comes along. The system eventually corrects itself because of visionary leadership.
Enter Henry Ford.
Enter Henry Ford.
Yeah.
In 1926, Henry Ford steps in and institutes the 5-day, 40-hour work week. He gives us the weekend. That has to be a win for humanity, right?
Well, this is a massive pivot point in how we understand our current reality. Because according to Skrylis, we have to fiercely deconstruct this myth of corporate benevolence.
Oh.
Henry Ford did not introduce the 5-day, 40-hour work week because he suddenly developed a deep humanitarian concern for the spiritual well-being of his assembly line workers.
Whoa.
He wasn't struck by a sudden urge to see his employees spend more time with their families playing catch in the yard.
No, it was a productivity hack.
Precisely. It was a hack. Ford was ruthless, and he was driven entirely by data.
Right. What did the data say?
His internal studies and efficiency experts were analyzing the assembly line, and they found a biological ceiling. They discovered that after exactly 8 hours of continuous, repetitive manual labor, human productivity completely plummeted.
The bodies just gave out.
The bodies gave out. Mistakes went up dramatically. Machinery accidents increased, which, cost the company money in repairs and delays. And overall output dropped to a point where paying the worker for the 9th, 10th, or 11th hour yielded diminishing returns.
It's basically treating the human body exactly like a machine component.
Yeah.
I mean, if you run a drill press at a certain RPM for too long, it overheats and breaks the bit. Ford's data essentially found the overheating point for the human nervous system and musculature. It was right around 8 hours a day.
Exactly. So the 40-hour week was never established as a holistic standard for a healthy, balanced human life. It wasn't based on how much time a person needs to, cook, rest, socialize, and pursue meaning.
No.
It was the exact mathematical sweet spot for extracting the maximum possible human output before the worker physically and mentally broke down and became a liability to the assembly line.
And there's a secondary, equally calculated motive here, wasn't there? It wasn't just about maximizing the time they spent building the cars. It was about what they did when they went home.
Oh, totally. The consumer side.
Right. Ford realized he had a macroeconomic problem.
Mm-hmm.
If his workers were in the factory for 16 hours a day, 6 days a week, they had absolutely no time to drive a car.
Let alone buy one.
Right. Furthermore, at the wages he was previously paying, they certainly didn't have the disposable income to buy one. So he institutes the $5 a day wage, and he gives them Saturday and Sunday off. Suddenly, he has manufactured his own consumer base.
The workers needed just enough free time and just enough disposable income to become consumers of the very products they were sacrificing their lives to build.
It's brilliant in a very dark way.
It's a perfectly closed loop.
Yeah.
You pay them to build the car, then you give them just enough time off so they hand that money right back to you to buy the car. Ford understood exactly what he was engineering. There's a very chilling quote attributed to him regarding the economic system he was helping to solidify.
Oh, the banking quote.
Yeah, and again, this is from the sources we're examining. He reportedly said, "It is well that the people of the nation do not understand our banking and monetary system, for if they did, I believe there would be a revolution before tomorrow morning."
Which really shows his hand. He knew exactly what the structure was doing to people.
Yeah. But let me pause and play devil's advocate here,
Yeah.
because I can hear a listener thinking this right now.
Sure.
Even if Ford's motives were purely selfish,
Yep.
purely driven by profit margins, data analysis, and, creating consumers going from a grueling 70-hour week in a dangerous factory down to 40 hours is undeniably, objectively better.
It is better.
People live longer, they got to see their kids on Sunday. Isn't it a bit cynical to criticize the exact policy that literally gave society the concept of the weekend?
It's a very fair pushback. And materially speaking, you are correct. Physically, a 40-hour week is vastly superior to the devastating 60 or 70-hour weeks of the 1800s. It absolutely saved lives.
Right.
But we have to look at what that compromise actually locked into place. It was a magician's trick of scale.
How so?
By reducing the hours just enough to alleviate absolute misery, Ford made the cage comfortable. And history shows us that when a cage becomes comfortable, the prisoner stops trying to dismantle it.
Ah, so it pacified the labor movement.
Exactly. Before the 40-hour standard, labor movements were fighting for radical changes. They were questioning the entire premise of wage labor. They were fighting for worker ownership. They were fighting for massive reductions in hours.
They wanted structural change.
Yes. By setting 40 hours as the seemingly reasonable global standard, society locked into a system that extracts the maximum sustainable labor forever. It halted the trajectory toward true leisure. It created a psychological baseline that we still adhere to a century later.
A full century.
Think about it. A century of unprecedented technological advancement, the invention of computers, the internet, robotics, and the 40-hour baseline hasn't budged.
So we negotiated for a slightly bigger cage, but in doing so, we essentially threw away the key. We accepted the premise that our time belongs to the employer by default, and we just get an allowance of time off on the weekends.
Right. It's a paradigm of ownership.
To truly understand how much time Ford and the Industrial Revolution stole from us, we have to contrast this modern 40-hour standard with what human life actually looked like before the factories took over.
This is where it gets really interesting.
Because our modern assumption is that medieval peasants worked infinitely harder than we do. But the data says something completely different.
This requires a massive paradigm shift in how we view history. We rely heavily here on the work of historian E.P. Thompson, who deeply analyzed the historical shift from what he called task-oriented work to time-oriented work.
Okay, let's break that down. Task-oriented versus time-oriented.
Yeah.
How does that change the human experience?
Well, for almost all of human history, stretching back millennia, work was task-oriented. It was dictated by the seasons, the weather, and the physical requirements of the job.
Right, like farming.
Exactly. If you were a pre-industrial farmer, you worked incredibly hard during the harvest. You worked from sunup to sundown, exhausting, back-breaking labor. But the crucial difference is this. When the harvest was done, the work was done.
You stopped.
You stopped. You rested. Your time belonged to you again. The rhythm of life was a series of intense bursts of labor, followed by deep, extended periods of rest and community.
You were answering to the task, not to a clock.
Precisely. Modern, time-oriented work flips that entirely. You work because the clock dictates it. The factory whistle replaced the sun.
9 to 5.
You arrive at 9 o'clock. You leave at 5 o'clock. It doesn't matter if you finished your tasks in 3 hours, like Tom Skrylis did in his consulting job. You owe the system your time, regardless of whether there is actual productive work to fill it.
The historical data backing this up is genuinely astonishing.
Mm-hmm.
When we picture a medieval peasant in the 1500s, we picture absolute misery.
Mud and disease.
Right. Non-stop, agonizing toil in the mud until they drop dead at age 30. But historically, sociologists and historians have found that medieval peasants had between 80 to 150 days off per year.
That's right. It sounds impossible to a modern worker, but it's true.
150 days.
The Catholic Church and local traditions enforced a massive amount of mandated rest. There were religious festivals, saints' days, community celebrations, weeks of feasting, and natural seasonal downtime during the harsh winter months where agricultural work was just impossible. They worked roughly 150 to 200 days a year.
Contrast that with the modern, supposedly liberated worker today. We are looking at a baseline of 250-plus working days a year.
And that's just the official days.
Right, and that is just the time spent actively at the desk or on the floor. That doesn't even account for the invisible labor of just getting to the job. The data points out that the average modern worker spends about 250 unpaid hours a year just commuting to and from their workplace.
Which is staggering when you add it up.
Let's do the math on that. If you divide 250 hours by a standard 40-hour work week, that is the equivalent of 6 full 40-hour work weeks stolen from your life every single year.
6 weeks.
Completely unpaid, just sitting in traffic or on the train to get to the place where you sell your time.
Which brings to sharp relief the grand broken promise of technology.
Oh, Keynes. We have to talk about Keynes.
Yes, John Maynard Keynes. Throughout the 20th century, brilliant economists like Keynes looked at the rise of machines, computers, and eventual automation, and they made a very logical, mathematical prediction.
What did he say?
They said automation would free humanity from toil. If a new machine can do the work of 10 men, then logically men will only have to work 1/10 of the time to maintain the same standard of living. Keynes predicted a 15-hour work week by the 21st century.
A 15-hour work week. Wow.
Yeah.
But that didn't happen. The machines got faster, the computers got smarter, but we are still sitting at the desks for 40 hours.
It didn't happen because the rules of the Enclosure Acts and Ford's assembly line never changed. The efficiency gains from technology did not go downward to the worker in the form of free time. They went upward to the owners in the form of extreme, unprecedented wealth accumulation.
They kept the surplus.
The system absorbed the surplus. We can look at a stark modern comparison to illustrate this. A worker on the floor of a modern Tesla factory, building highly advanced electric vehicles, makes roughly $60,000 a year. Over a 40-year working lifetime, that worker will earn about $2.4 million total. Meanwhile, in the year 2024, Elon Musk's wealth was growing by roughly $24 million per hour.
Per hour. It's like we completely upgraded our mode of transportation, but we never changed the flight plan.
What do you mean?
Imagine we were flying in a propeller plane, and it took 10 hours to cross the country. Then we invent a supersonic jet. It's an incredible technological marvel. We get on the jet, and it flies us across the country in 2 hours.
Okay.
But instead of landing the plane, letting us get off, and letting us pick a nap on the beach to enjoy the time we saved the pilot, just keeps flying the supersonic jet in endless, dizzying circles above the airport for the remaining 8 hours until we run out of fuel. The technology got infinitely faster, but we were never allowed to get off the clock.
That conceptualization is exactly right. We are trapped in the holding pattern. And what's worse, modern jobs have actually weaponized that new technology to ensure the holding pattern expands into our homes.
Oh, because of the internet.
Right. The office isn't a physical place you can leave behind at 5 p.m. anymore. The architecture of the factory floor now lives in your pocket.
The smartphone. The ultimate tether.
We live in a state of continuous mandatory connectivity. An email arrives from a manager on Sunday morning. A Slack notification buzzes during dinner with your family.
You can't escape it.
The psychological boundary between my time and company time has been completely eroded. Psychologists call this a state of continuous partial attention.
Continuous partial attention. I feel that in my bones.
We all do. Even when you are technically off the clock, a percentage of your brain is scanning for threats, scanning for alerts. You are never fully resting. You are spread across multiple streams of awareness.
Which leads directly into the attention economy, because this state of continuous partial attention creates a very specific kind of exhaustion.
A deep fatigue.
Right. When you are deeply fundamentally tired from your 40-hour week and the constant connectivity, you don't have the cognitive bandwidth to create art, to think intentionally about your life, or to engage in deep, fulfilling hobbies. So what do?
You sit on the couch.
You consume. You sit on the couch and you scroll. You binge watch. The attention economy feeds on the exact exhaustion created by the labor economy. It creates a society that is perpetually busy, constantly stimulated by flashing screens, but entirely hollowly unfulfilled.
It's a vicious cycle.
Which, frankly, is an incredibly depressing reality to confront. But it begs a massive question.
What's that?
If this system is so exhausting, so historically unnatural compared to task-oriented work, and so psychologically unfulfilling, how does it reproduce itself?
Right. Why do we put up with it?
Generation after generation, millions of people graduate and step right into the cage. Why isn't there a massive continuous revolt? Why do we just accept the 40-hour loop as natural law?
That is the core of the invisible chains. The system doesn't need to use violent force or deploy a secret police to maintain order if it can successfully train you to police yourself.
Self-policing.
And that training has to start before a person ever has the critical thinking skills to question it.
Which brings us to the psychological conditioning of childhood. The critique looks at the modern education system not just as a noble place of academic learning, but as a literal physical rehearsal for industrial employment.
Think about the actual physical and psychological architecture of a standard school. What is the inherent nature of a child?
They want to run around.
Children are wildly curious, highly energetic, and physically dynamic, but the institutional system requires them to completely suppress that nature for 8 hours a day.
Sit at the desk.
They must sit still at a desk. They must obey arbitrary mechanical bells that dictate exactly when they can move from one room to another, mimicking the factory whistle.
That's a huge parallel to bells.
It is, and most fundamentally, they must raise their hand and ask a designated authority figure for permission to attend to their most basic biological needs, like using the restroom or drinking water.
It's conditioning absolute compliance. It's teaching a human being that their body is not their own jurisdiction during institutional hours.
Exactly, and over 12 or 16 years, this calcifies into a rigid personality structure. You learn to seek validation entirely from authority figures.
The grades?
The gold stars you get in kindergarten seamlessly become letter grades in high school, which seamlessly transition into performance reviews and KPI metrics in the corporate world.
It's all the same metric of obedience.
You are systematically trained to measure your self-worth by how well you meet someone else's arbitrary metrics. By the time you are a 22-year-old adult entering the workforce, the training is so thorough, so deeply embedded in your psyche, that handing over your time and autonomy feels like the most natural thing in the world.
But the body knows. Even if the mind has been conditioned to accept the performance review and the commute as normal, the physical animal body knows it is living in an unnatural state.
It definitely knows.
Tom Scralius talks about this physiological rebellion, specifically the phenomenon of the Sunday funeral.
Yes, the Sunday funeral. It is a brilliant term for a very dark biological reality.
I think almost everyone listening to this knows exactly what this feeling is. It's that very specific, creeping, heavy dread that usually peaks around 3:0 or 4:0 p.m. on a Sunday afternoon.
The weekend is over.
It's the realization that the brief window of freedom the weekend is slipping away. The sun starts to go down, and your body realizes it has to go back into the cage in a few hours.
Right.
Your rational brain might be saying, I have a good job, I have a salary, I should be grateful, it's fine. But your nervous system is essentially screaming, I am not safe here, do not make me go back. It's a spike in cortisol that ruins the rest you're supposed to be getting.
The physiological toll of this cognitive dissonance is undeniable. This isn't just about feeling a little tired on a Monday. We are talking about chronic, compounding stress that physically breaks down the human body.
What does that look like medically?
It manifests as high blood pressure, chronic inflammation, autoimmune flare-ups, and severe muscle tension. Scrylus shares a deeply personal anecdote about his wife, who worked as a social worker.
Oh, the rubber bowl story.
Yeah. She worked in a highly demanding, emotionally draining job within a bureaucratic system. He describes how she would come home and have to lie on the floor, positioning her back over a hard rubber ball for up to an hour every single night.
Just to release the tension.
She wasn't just resting, she was trying to physically force the localized tension, the literal muscle knots, out of her back and neck. That is trauma stored in the body. That is the physical manifestation of a system that extracts more than the organism can naturally replenish.
And here is the darkest part of the entire critique, the part that really shifts this from a tragic side effect to a systemic design. Burnout is not a bug in the system.
No.
Burnout is a feature.
This is a vital concept to grasp. If you are chronically exhausted, you cannot plan an escape.
Exactly. If you use your entire weekend, those precious 48 hours, merely to biologically recover from the trauma of the previous 5 days.
Just catching your breath.
Right. If you spend Saturday and Sunday just lying on the couch in a low-energy state so you have just enough battery life to produce again on Monday morning, you have absolutely no cognitive bandwidth left.
Done.
You don't have the energy to build a side business, to learn a new skill that could liberate you, to engage deeply with your community, or to organize politically to change the laws.
You are kept in a perpetual state of low-level survival. When you are surviving, you cannot strategize. The system secures its own longevity by draining the excess energy you would need to challenge it.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener? I have to ask this because it's easy to spiral here.
It is very easy to spiral.
Is this just a giant depressing conspiracy? Is there a literal smoky backroom of billionaires twirling their mustaches and plotting exactly how to exhaust us so we buy more takeout food?
Probably not.
Or is there a functional, structural reason why society evolved this way? And furthermore, if it's really this damaging to the human body and mind, Wouldn't the system eventually just collapse under the dead weight of its own burned-out, chronically ill workforce?
It is highly unlikely to be a literal conspiracy plotted in a smoke-filled room. Systems this large don't usually require mustache-twirling villains. They operate on momentum and core programming.
Okay, so what's the programming?
It is much more accurate to view this as an emergent property of hypercapitalism. The system is fundamentally algorithmically optimized for one single variable: the maximization of profit over the preservation of humanity.
Right.
And the reason it doesn't collapse under the weight of burned-out workers is deeply cynical. It treats human labor as a fully disposable, renewable resource.
The text mentions the old geezer's concept, the discarding of the tired.
Precisely. The system doesn't need you to last 40 years at peak performance. It constantly recruits fresh, younger workers, new graduates who are full of energy, desperate to prove themselves, and willing to work 80-hour weeks because they haven't yet felt the physiological toll.
They don't know any better yet.
Right. They run those young workers redline until they burn out. As workers get older, as they start to demand higher salaries for their experience, as they want to spend time with their children, or as their bodies inevitably face health issues from the chronic stress, they are simply discarded.
We see this all the time with corporate restructuring.
All the time. Mass layoffs of senior staff aren't a sign of system failure or accidental mismanagement. They are a sign of routine system optimization. Clear out the expensive, tired components and plug in the fresh, cheap ones.
So the machine keeps running perfectly, leaving a trail of exhausted human beings in its wake.
Yes.
Which is heavy, but it also offers a bizarre kind of clarity. The key takeaway for the listener here isn't just to despair. It's to start recognizing your own bodily signals as legitimate data.
That is so important.
That Sunday dread, that bone-deep exhaustion, that physical tension in your shoulders, that is valid information. Your body is telling you the truth about your environment.
Exactly. The most empowering thing you can do is realize that it is not a personal failure on your part. You do not lack resilience. You aren't failing at time management. You are having a completely normal biological reaction to an environment that was historically engineered to extract your energy.
It's working as designed.
It is. Recognizing the historical architecture of the cage, seeing the bars for what they are, is the absolute first step to finding the exit.
And that is exactly what we set out to do today. We've traced the blueprint of these invisible chains.
We covered a lot of ground.
We did. We started with the literal land thefts of the 1773 Enclosure Acts, exploring how the forceful removal of self-sufficiency created a desperate labor pool. We broke down Henry Ford's manipulative productivity hack in 1926 that locked us into the 40-hour loot, permanently stalling the promise of true leisure.
Right.
We examined the algorithmic surveillance tracking our bathroom breaks, and we unpacked how the physical architecture of the school system conditions us from childhood to accept this total surrender of autonomy as normal.
It's a comprehensive historical architecture of control, and seeing it changes how you view your daily life.
To you listening, if you have ever felt like your time is being stolen, if you've ever felt that deep, unexplainable exhaustion, even when you supposedly have a cushy job, well, history proves you right. The cage was built slowly, brick by brick, law by law, over centuries.
It didn't happen overnight.
No, it didn't. But as Scralius and these historical perspectives argue, once you see the architecture, once you understand the history of the enclosures and the math of the assembly line, you realize the door isn't actually locked.
And I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over as you go about your week, building on everything we've discussed today about energy and exhaustion.
Okay, lay it on us.
We've talked extensively about how the 40-hour work week is designed to drain you. But consider this secondary layer of the trap. What if the system actually relies on your lack of time and energy to fuel an entirely massive secondary economy?
Oh, wow. I see where you're going with this.
Think about the multi-billion-dollar industries that surround us today. The ones we rely on just to get through the week.
The convenience economy.
Exactly. App-based food delivery, because you are too tired to cook. Ultra-processed convenience goods, because you need cheap, fast calories.
Right.
Endless streaming and binge-watching subscriptions, because you only have the cognitive energy to stare at a screen.
Right.
The massive spa, wellness, and sleep aid industries desperately trying to sell you back a fraction of the piece the work week stole. If you and millions of others actually had the time and the energy to cook nutritious meals from scratch, to build your own furniture, to repair your own clothes, to rest organically in your community without a premium subscription, entire sectors of the global economy would instantly collapse.
That is incredibly sobering. Your exhaustion isn't just an unfortunate byproduct of your job. Your exhaustion is a highly lucrative product in itself.
It's the foundation of those markets.
The system generates the wound, and then an entire secondary market springs up to sell you the bandage.
Exactly. Your lack of time is the engine of their profit.
Thank you so much for joining us on this exploration. I hope it gives you some clarity, a new lens to view history through, and maybe a profound sense of validation. So the next time you feel that pit in your stomach on a Sunday afternoon, remember the doctor's office. There's no disease, you're just employed. Stay curious, question the normal rhythms of your week, and we'll catch you next time.